Number 1. This must have happened about a year ago now, around Halloween. And to this day, it still creeps me the fuck out. Me and my twin sister, Lauren, both 20 now, had moved into our first flat 3 months before this happened. Our parents helped us move into the flat. My dad hiring a van to get all of our stuff, and the whole family, including my older brother Sam, who was visiting from England, helped us move furniture and numerous boxes into the flat. Our family helped us settle in, and luckily enough, our flat was actually next door to one of our dad's old friends, Danny, which was great as we hadn't seen him or his wife in about 10 years. The neighborhood we live in, which is a smallish village, about an hour or so from Glasgow in Scotland, is 99% of the time really quiet and everybody around the area is really nice, but this one night, something wasn't quite right. Like I've said already, we had only really got used to the area we were living in, but after what happened this one night, I always have my wits about me now. It was a dark winter's night in late October/early November, a Thursday I think. My sister and I decided to stay up until about 1:30 in the morning, as we sometimes did after a long week at college. We'd stay up drinking, stuffing our faces, and talking about random stuff like acting, the subject we were both studying, motorbikes, guys, and some bitching too, just like any normal young women would do. We then decided to put the lights out and go to bed as we had grown tired. I'd do the normal nightly routine like check everything was turned off and the door was locked, which it was thankfully, as a few nights previously I had forgotten to lock it, so we both went to bed and fell asleep as usual. Just to set the layout of the flat, me and my sister were on the first floor, above an old woman, Betty, who is rather lovely, but we don't see her very often. Our bedroom is right next to the porch and the front door, and our bedroom window looks out onto the street. It was about 4 a.m. when we awoke to a loud knocking at our door. I was expecting a parcel the next day, so initially thought it would be the postman. But that's when I checked the time on my phone, which I usually leave on in case of emergencies, and it was 4:30 in the morning. Still being tired and disoriented, I realized it was far too dark to be about 10 a.m. when the postman usually came, even though the mornings were much darker now during the winter months. The banging on the door lasted about what felt like 20 minutes, but was probably less. Me and my sister were too scared to move from our beds, only whispering quietly to each other to just ignore the banging on the door. Neither of us were very comfortable about answering the door to a stranger knocking at an ungodly hour. I don't usually answer the door to strangers, or even answer mobile numbers I don't recognize. The banging stopped suddenly, and I heard heavy footsteps descend down the stairs next to the wall near my head. Everything fell silent for a few minutes. I tried to settle back down, but my adrenaline was going crazy. I could feel my legs shaking. I was so nervy about whoever it was outside. There was no way I was getting back to sleep. Then I saw the flashing of a torch through our bedroom window. It flashed at least 3 times, but maybe more. Then it stopped. I then heard what sounded like the man talking on the phone to someone, or having a conversation with someone outside, sounding a bit agitated and angry. I didn't look outside of our bedroom window in case the man saw me, but a few minutes later, I heard the rumbling of a car engine below me. I then assumed that he came in his car. His voice became increasingly explosive as I became more and more scared. It got to the point where I was about to phone the police, but then I heard the man opening his car door and leaving swiftly along the street. I don't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I didn't sleep at all that night. And for the next few days after that, every single noise would give me a fright. I was scared that whoever it was going to come back. In the end, I thought that it was someone with the wrong address or maybe just a drunk guy, but about a week later, we got a knock at about 6:30 in the evening, which was unusual for such a quiet area, and neither me or my sister were expecting any mail packages or shopping to be delivered, so I decided to open the door to whoever had knocked. Initially, I thought it was our neighbor, as he had been round once before to see how we were settling in, but not this time. It was a woman who was dressed in a suit and looked very professional, her hair up in a tight bun and holding a clipboard. I was a bit anxious and wondered who the hell she was. I looked down at her name badge, but I can't remember her name now. Let's call her Molly. Molly said she worked for the criminal courts and was looking for a guy, let's call him Thomas, who had previously been a tenant at this flat before we moved in a few months before. Molly mentioned something to do with money, but the visit was so vague, I don't really remember what she said. She asked if the man lived here. I said no, just me and my sister. She asked when we moved in and what letting agency we were with, but I think it was just to confirm that we did live there. She seemed nice enough, got what she wanted, and left, so I'm guessing money is the reason why the creepy guy turned up a few nights previously, banging loudly on our door. I'm so glad I didn't answer the door that night, and that I made sure it was locked. Fuck knows what would have happened if he thought that we were the man he and the courts were looking for. I am happy to say, since then, we have had no further disturbances at our flat, but it still gives me the chills just thinking about it. I just hope this creep never comes back. Number 2. So this just happened to me today, and I'm still traumatized over it. I'm a female in my early 20s and was on my way to a job interview. I live in the capital of my country and the interview was in the city center. I don't drive, so I have to use public transport. To get to my interview, I had to walk through some shady parts of the inner city center, which is unpleasant on any given day, but as it gets dark by 5 p.m., it's even worse. Anyway, I got to the street my interview was at, but I couldn't find the building it was in. I tried ringing the company to ask for directions, but their phones kept ringing out. After about 15 minutes of walking up and down the same street to no avail, I noticed I was nearing the time for my interview. I decided to enter this old man's pub, as I like to call them. Basically the local pub where all the old farts and unemployed people usually spend their evenings getting pissed. I forgot to mention I was wearing a black dress, black blazer, tights, and small office-type heels, so I must have stuck out like a sore thumb. I walked up to the barman and I asked him if he knew where the building I was looking for was. But before he even got a chance to answer, this fella in his mid-20s asked me, "Is it for an interview?" My attire obviously gave me away. I said yes, and he said with a half-lipped smile, "I know where that is. It's at my house." I kind of half laughed and tried to turn my back to him. The barman had gone to the other side of the bar, so I was waiting for him to come back to continue asking for directions to the building. Then, out of nowhere, it seems another fella in his mid-20s pops up on a bar stool beside me, so now I'm sandwiched between these two dudes. Thinking that the other dude who just came over might not be as creepy, I asked him if he knew where I was looking for. "Are you doing a presentation?" he asked. No, it's for a job interview." "I was hoping it was for a presentation so you could show me your slides," he said while breaking into a creepy laugh and high-fiving the other guy over my head. Screw this, I thought, and pushed my way through them leaving the pub. By the time I got outside, it was pitch black, and I was late for my interview. I just wanted to go home. As I was walking down the street, I noticed that the two creepers had followed me out of the pub and were about 20 feet behind me. One shouted, "Come back, love, we just want to see your slit." And the other one threw something at me that felt like a small stone. I was absolutely terrified. Even though there were people around, I felt so scared and alone. As I was crossing by a set of traffic lights, they caught up to me and both stood on either side of me. One of them said, "Let's go for a walk, then go back to my place." So nonchalantly, he then linked his arm into mine and was pulling me across the road, while the other one kept laughing and rubbing my back. I was thinking, what the fuck? How is this happening on a populated street in front of tons of people? I screamed and pulled my arm away from him, telling him I will kick him in the balls if he didn't get his fucking hands off me. An older man about 10 feet in front of us heard the commotion and asked if everything was okay. That's when one of the dudes says, "This is my girlfriend. She's only joking. Don't worry, we are on our way back to my place. Thanks, though, bud." I was stuck for words. I couldn't believe this fuck had the balls to try and abduct me in a populated area in the middle of the evening. The old man must have seen the fear in my eyes because he didn't buy it. "I don't think so, pal. Leave her alone, or I'll break your neck." The dude closest to me pushed me, and the two of them took off running. I thanked the man profusely for what he did. He wanted me to call the police, but I just wanted to go home, so he walked me to a nearby taxi rank and offered to pay my fare home. Of course I refused. I was already so grateful to him I couldn't take his money as well. The whole ride home I could not stop shaking, and I'm still very upset and shaken up as I write this. Creepy would-be rapists / abductors, let's not meet again. Number 3. Hello there. My name is Zach. This all started in the summer of 2015, back when I worked at the Walmart of my town pushing carts. I'm not sure the exact date it all started, although I do recall it was around the 4th of July. It all started with a simple call over my radio with a request to help someone load their items into their car. Glad to get out of the hot summer heat, if only for a few moments, I responded quickly, saying I'd be right over it and hurried in. I walked over to the register where the customer had requested assistance. The customer was a heavy-set, middle-aged man who had purchased a 52-inch flat screen. I greeted the man with a warm hello and a smile, which he returned. The man stood at about 6'8" and spoke with a deep southern accent. He offered his hand for me to shake, which I did before he led me to his van. On the way, he made small talk with me, asking how my day was, how old I was, if I liked my job, etc. I answered all his questions honestly, saying that my day was going fine so far, that I was 19, and I could have a worse job than this. We got to his gray van and worked together to load his TV into the back. Before parting ways, he asked me where I lived and if I lived alone. Now this wasn't unusual, as a few other customers had asked me this before in the past. I simply said no. I stayed with my grandparents, having been too poor to afford to live by myself at the time, and I lived a mile or two out of town. I took the man's cart, wished him a good day, and walked off. It was a few days after that I realized, whenever I worked, that gray van would be in the parking lot. I didn't think too much of it, as it wasn't unusual for people to shop at Walmart every single day, so I would just go about my work. That was until a week afterwards when, after noticing the same gray van, I turned to a fellow cart pusher named Joe and said, "That gray van is always here." Joe nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I know, dude. Although it's strange, I've only ever seen that van here when you're working." Confused, I asked what he meant. He responded, "I've only ever seen that van here during your shift. It leaves shortly after you do when you clock out." I found that to be a little strange, but I blew it off as a coincidence. One day, I noticed that gray van would follow me everywhere I went. I don't own a car, so I walk everywhere I go. I don't really mind as I enjoy walking. Again, I would just chalk up the van always following me as a coincidence. Pretty sure the van was just heading in the same direction. Although I always found it odd that the van never drove past me as I walked, but always hung back, not caring if it was holding up traffic. Red flags didn't start going off until I spotted that gray van trailing me on a Wednesday night as I was walking back home from my youth group meeting at church. At first I just brushed it off as usual, until it followed me out of town. Normally it would turn away when I left city limits, but this time, it continued to follow me. I started to feel as though something wasn't right about this, and I began to wish I had my pocket knife on me, just in case. The van followed me until I walked into my driveway before turning off. I got the chills at this point, and I made sure to lock the doors when I entered my house. The next night, I was walking home in the dark again after a men's group Bible study. The memory of last night was burned in my mind, and I decided that if the van followed me to my house again, I would notify the police in the morning. Sure enough, it ended up trailing me. I gritted my teeth, sick of whoever this person was. However, the van pulled off a few feet ahead of me and stopped. The driver's side door opened and the customer who I had helped with the TV stepped out and approached me. He greeted me like everything was normal and asked me where I was headed. I told him I was headed home, making a mental note to tell the police about this guy first thing in the morning. The man continued to act friendly and offered me a ride home, stating it was too dark for me to walk home, and that weirdos might try something. I declined, saying I didn't live that far away, but he kept insisting it was too dangerous and that I should ride with him. The more I said no, the more he kept pushing for me to get in his van. It was at this point I decided I was done and started to walk past this guy when he put his hand on my arm and started pulling me to his van, stating that he was giving me a ride, whether I liked it or not. Being a 19-year-old young man, I had always thought I would be able to easily handle a situation like this should it happen. However, panic had taken over my body, and my mind raced for a way to get away from this guy. Pretty sure wherever this guy wanted to take me, it sure wasn't my house. Now, I don't know if it was a miracle or just plain luck, but at that moment a police car drove by and pulled into the nearby gas station to fill up. The man let go of my arm, wished me a good night, got into his van, and sped off. I decided to talk with the cop while he was getting gas, telling him about the past events. The cop ended up driving me home, telling me if I saw the guy again to immediately call the police. It's been months now and I haven't seen that guy again. I eventually quit my job and moved to another state starting college. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened to me if that cop hadn't drove by that night. Whoever you are, owner of that gray van, let's not meet again. Number 4. This story still creeps me out, but I'm happy to share it with you. I like to go for walks in the dark. I'm not sure if this is strange or if everyone does it, but it just makes everything really creepy. I live in a well-civilized area with a lot of friends who live extremely close to me. Around 2 kilometers from my house is a heavily wooded area. I like to follow a 4-wheel drive track when I go for my walks. It was around 9:30 p.m. on a Friday night, and I was going for a walk down the 4-wheel drive track when I heard a very light scream in the distance. I assumed it was just some kids playing, so I kept walking, until I heard it again. At this point, I knew someone was in trouble. I ran for my life hoping that I could help this person. I ran for about 100 meters when I came to the end of the track and looked around. One of the first things I saw was a girl about 19 years old being held by a 40-year-old looking man. When the man saw me, he dropped the girl and legged it around the corner. I sprinted over to the woman who was busy crying, obviously shaken up. We ended up calling the police, and they came and took my statement and took the girl home. I am glad that I still go for my walks. If I didn't, a girl probably would not be here today. Number 5. So this happened about 6 years ago now. I was 14 at the time, and I just moved to Australia. One of the girls in my grade was having a picnic in the park, about 30 minutes away from my house, but I was keen to make friends and so was up for a trip. Anyway, I arrive at this park at about 1 p.m. on a Saturday, and it's great. We eat potato salad. There are other families around. It's chill. But I know I have homework, so I say goodbye a little earlier to make my own way home. I was at an age that meant I was exercising my independence, so I enjoyed public transport and such. As I'm walking through a suburban area, two things occur to me. The first is that it's really quiet for a midday on a weekend. The second, I've been followed since I left the park. I turn around, feeling a little startled, but it's just some guy on his bike. This isn't really unusual, but there's something about the way this 40-something man's leisurely pace that makes my skin crawl. The guy is clearly into cycling. He's geared up with sunglasses and all the lycra, but he maintained a pace just so that he was several seconds behind me. I move a little faster, speeding up to see his reaction, but sure enough, he speeds up. And as I slow down again, he ends up cycling next to me. I ignore this and just make it seem as though I'm totally unfazed. He then smiles to me and asks for the time. I inform him of the time, but he just stays there. He just keeps cycling next to me. Suddenly, he cycles very close to me and leaning towards me mutters, "I'm the type of guy who likes to have sex with young girls. Interested?" I was terrified. At 14, I didn't even look 14. I had a boyish build and terrible acne. This guy was at least 40, and he was blocking my route to the nearest houses with his bike. "No, I wouldn't," I managed to say, in an attempt at confidence. This clearly undermined whatever this guy was thinking, because he pedals off like a speeding bullet. I ran home and called the police, and they swept the area. But they never found him again. Number 6.
I've been lurking on the sub for a while and wanted to share my story. It's Thanksgiving 2011, and I was celebrating at my grandparents' farm in the little town of Seville, Florida. I had had way too much to eat that holiday and was about to leave for the drive back to school in Tallahassee. I stopped at one little gas station in town to fill up before getting on the highway. I had just finished filling up when a lady walked up to me. She was really ratty looking with crazy blonde dyed hair, but this was the backwoods of Florida, so no judgment. They were really kind people who looked like that in those parts. She started talking to me about how her car had run out of gas. She pointed over to an old junker parked over in the convenience store and asked if I could possibly give her some cash to get home. I usually don't say yes to things like that, but it was Thanksgiving weekend, so I was feeling extra generous. I told her that I'd be happy to fill up her car a little to get her home. That's when it started getting weird. She kept insisting I'd give her cash and that her car was so empty she couldn't drive to the pump. I don't know why I didn't leave right then and there, but again, I was in a really good mood. I told her if she had a gas can, I would put some in, but didn't feel comfortable giving her cash. She kept objecting, but eventually went over and pulled a gas can from her car. I started filling it up. She put her hand on me and said, "Do you have a girlfriend?" I told her no politely. She said she wanted to pay me back somehow for the gas and asked if I wanted to come to her place. I told her no, less politely. She kept touching my shoulder, thanking me, and then offered me a blowjob behind the station, so I stopped the gas pump, got in my car, and left her there with the gas can. I called my mom a little later and told her about the creepy, sleazy encounter. She paused and asked me if this lady had ratty blonde hair and looked like she was on drugs. I confirmed that, yes, that was what she looked like, and how could she know that? This lady was apparently all over the news. She was a prostitute in town and had been at a party earlier. An exchange had gone south and her baby had been kidnapped by a client of hers and left under a bush in town. She hadn't even bothered to call the police about the missing child until later. They were both arrested and charged.
Number 7.
Okay, so I'm a long-time lurker and a first-time poster, but this is a story my mom told me that took place when I was about 2 or 3 years old. It takes place in Glasgow, a city in Scotland. I've lived there since I was born, and it's generally not too bad a place for creepiness. However, this was scary. So my mom was taking my dog for a walk and carrying me. We were walking in the park, which was very big and had a big statue in the middle of it. Since we didn't have a car then, it was the closest place to walk the dog. Everything was pretty normal until suddenly this big black car starts coming towards us. My mom says it looked very suspicious, windows tinted and stuff. There was a tall blonde woman apparently in the front, with no one else supposedly with her. The fact that a car was coming up out of the park was very strange, because it was quite late, so no one would frequent the park then. My mom was getting warning signals because the car itself and the person driving it, but she slowed down. The woman drew up beside us and gave my mom a huge, very strange smile, as if they had been best friends. Now, this is Scotland, so a lot of people know each other, but my mom had no idea who this person was. Then, the woman gave her a big wave and rolled down the window, saying, "Hello, you look like you need a lift. Would you like a lift with us?" This was creepy because there was no one else in the car that we could see. My mom also said that the woman was staring at me in particular. My mom smiled back, trying to be friendly, and politely declined. However, the woman seemed put out by this and said, "I think your dog is getting hungry. How about we give him a few treats?" My mom was definitely creeped out now, and my dog was definitely not hungry. He had eaten before we left. So she just said, "Oh, no thanks, he'll be fine." Suddenly the woman went from smiley to angry. My mom said she looked almost furious. Then she revved up the engine and took off out of the park. To this day, me and my mom still think there was someone in the back of the car, because the windows were tinted heavily. Whether or not the woman meant harm, though, is undecided. But we never went to that park again.
Number 8. I'm a 17-year-old girl and I live in a rural area. My house is almost entirely visible from the road. I'm typing this almost exactly 30 minutes after it happened and I'm still shaking. 30 minutes ago at 5 a.m., I was sleeping deeply and someone slowly opened my bedroom window. My bed is literally right next to the window so I can open and close it. I was sleeping and I could hear my window slowly opening upwards since it's old and heavy. I thought I was dreaming or it was a possum because they live on the tree outside it. It's 5 a.m. and it's getting light at about this time. My bedroom is isolated and at the back of the house, but there is a complete driveway and full access to it there. And holy shit, I realize it's a person opening the window. I look through my makeshift curtain and I say, "What the fuck?" There's a figure outside my window. They slam the window down quickly, right next to my face, when they realize there's a person less than a meter from them. I could see the figure because there is still some light, but nothing else. I start yelling, I go to my parents, etc. They check the area, but they can't see any cars or people as it's covered in trees. All in the meanwhile, I think I'm crazy. How could that have happened? Was I dreaming? But my curtain is tucked under the window, and my cat is going crazy, and I know what happened. It was terrifying. I'm sure that they were a thief. We've had some dodgy people around my area before, but I swear, when it happened, I thought it was a ghost or something. I was terrified because I've been reading a lot of this subreddit and the subreddit NoSleep. Now I have to get ready for school. My parents are going to put a lock on my window. Update. I don't understand why someone would try to rob a house at 5 a.m. My dad's awake every morning before 5 and there is light still in the sky. If it was earlier in the night, it probably would have been way scarier. A policewoman came. She explained about crimes in the area. She looked for footprints and fingerprints but couldn't really see any, as it was raining. She was really kind, but I'm still spooked. I don't know if anyone will read this, but a few hours later, my parents discovered the window adjacent to mine had chisel marks on it, and it was fairly damaged. Obviously, this means they tried to break in through there but couldn't, and then tried my window. Number 9. I have provided links for news coverage of the following story in the video description below. This is the story that my dad shared with me. He grew up in a small suburb community of Stowe, Ohio, with his parents and older sister. Across the street lived a boy named Richard Wade Coy. He was the same age as my dad, who described him as a scrawny, red-headed troublemaker. He would spit on people as they walked by, and even set a house on fire in the neighborhood and blamed it on a kid who had special needs. Nothing he did as a child, however, could compare to the crime he committed when he was only 19 years old. My dad had just started his sophomore year of college when he heard the news. Richard and his friends Clinton and Kenneth were throwing pieces of concrete off a local bridge onto the interstate when one of them struck the vehicle of 21-year-old Wendy Ofrendo. Her friend, 20-year-old Dawn McCreary, was also in the car. They were sorority sisters who had just gotten off of work at a local restaurant. At this point, Kenneth decided he'd had enough and went home. This is when Richard and Clinton came up with their evil scheme. Both of the young men approached the girls, offering them help, offering to give them a ride. They drove the girls to a shopping center where they told them to call their parents and let them know they were alright. The two then forced the girls back into the car, tied their hands together, and drove them to a field behind the local mall where they raped, stabbed, and tortured them for 3 grueling hours. They abandoned their bodies in the field, but only after they carved large X's on their stomachs. Richard and Clinton then decided they wanted to sell the girls' clothing and jewelry to make some extra cash. When Richard couldn't find a buyer for the items, he burned them in his backyard, which woke my grandparents. My grandfather called the police to report what he thought was yet another neighborhood disturbance from Richard. The police gathered the items for evidence, and after finding Wendy's abandoned car, they arrested Richard and began the investigation. Clinton and Richard were both arrested and charged with the murders. They had found a bloody pocket knife used to stab Wendy in the neck in Clinton's pocket when he was arrested, and some of the burned items still had traces of the girl's blood. Since Clinton was only 17, he was spared the death sentence and currently is serving life in prison. Richard, however, was given the death penalty. On October 14th, 2003, at 10 a.m., Richard was executed by lethal injection. Wendy's family was present at the execution. Every time I visit my grandparents and look across the street at that house, I can't help but to get the chills. Richard, I'm glad we never met, and I'm certainly glad my dad was smart enough to not become your friend growing up. Number 10. It was March during spring break. I was 16 at the time, and me and about 20 people went out into the woods in Surrey County and got a cabin on this nice little retreat center. We planned on staying there for 4 days. For a bit more detail, the cabin was surrounded on all sides by woods. To the west of the cabin are some hunting trails, and a creepy abandoned trailer next to a small clearing with a single pine tree in the center. To the east, there was a large field. At the far end of the field, there is a slope leading down to a beach. When going to the slope to the right, there is an area of higher elevation, and to the left was a valley that could be accessed from the beach. On the last night, a group of about 8 of us decided we'd go down to the beach and sit around and sing songs while playing guitars. It was about 11 p.m. Everything was going fine, and then 3 of the guys decided to head back to the cabin and get some food. They were only gone for 10 minutes before one of the guys got a call from his brother. His reaction to the call made it seem like something happened or someone was hurt. When he got off the phone, he said, "We have to leave right fucking now," in a very hushed and panicky voice. We all asked why, and he told us that while the others were walking back, they had found a rabbit at the top of the trail with his head cut clean off. Not ripped off like an animal doing it, but cut like someone took a knife to the rabbit. We automatically thought they had to be fucking with us. We began walking back, brandishing the guitar and a metal pipe as weapons in case they really weren't fucking with us. About halfway up the hill, we hear rustling and twigs snapping to our right where the valley is. It sounded like someone was walking up the side of the steep slope, which would not be possible without climbing gear. We stopped moving, but the movement and noise continued. We told them to knock it the fuck off if it was a joke and it wasn't funny. The movement to the right stopped very suddenly. We kept going, and once we neared the top of the hill, I turned on my phone's flashlight, and right on the ground in front of me lay a rabbit with its head cut off. We took off running, and heard someone, or something, come out of the woods. We didn't stop running until we got back to the cabin. When we got to the cabin, we found all the guys sitting inside. We locked up every door and all of the windows. Me and two of the other guys stayed up all night to keep watch and make sure whatever it was didn't follow us to the cabin. We fell asleep around 6:30 a.m. We awoke around 8 a.m. to one of the girls screaming about a rabbit's head on the front porch. Number 11. I'm a 5'3" female, presently gender fluid 17-year-old. When I was 16, me and my girlfriend, who's about 5'7" and easily stronger than me, went to the mall because we both had the same stuff we needed to pick up. As a bit of backstory, my ex, who is still my friend to this day, is a total fucking badass, and not in the way where she looks cool. I mean, she does, but that's not the point. She's badass in the way where she knows how to throw knives, was a master archer at like age 10, and held her own in a fight because her parents ran a bounty hunting service at the time. Anyway, we were leaving a store, holding hands the whole time because we were fucking adorable, and she turned to kiss my cheek, and right before she turned to face ahead again, she whispered in my ear, "We're being followed. Giggle when I turn forward, and don't turn around." My blood ran cold, and I stared at her for a second before she smiled at me. I forced a laugh and squeezed her hand out of nervousness. We live in Texas, so radical homophobes aren't exactly uncommon. I personally know a few LGBT friends who've gotten jumped or almost raped by people like this, so I was very scared. I began to focus into what they were saying, and, as I thought, they were talking about the fucking dykes in front of them. Thanks. I leaned over to tell her what I heard, and she squeezed my hand, silently telling me that she knows and she's listening. My hearing's never been the best, and the mall was fairly busy, so I couldn't easily decipher what they were saying after that. I guess she heard something though, because her grip tightened, and when I looked at her, she actually looked nervous, which obviously isn't a look I'd seen on her before. She always carries a pocket knife on her, and now was no exception. We headed to the bathroom at this time, a very desolate part of the mall, so as soon as we were clear of everyone's eyes, except who we were being followed by, she took it as an opportunity to show them who exactly they were dealing with. She pulled out her knife and put it in her back pocket to show them she had it. When they kept following us, she pulled it back out, stopped walking, and opened it. She cracked her neck, and I heard one of the guys mutter, "Shit." They walked past us, glancing back when they were about 10 feet ahead. I'm just lucky my ex-girlfriend was fucking awesome. And I'm just glad those homophobic dickheads fucked off. Number 12. I was 8 years old when this happened. It was a hot summer day, so my dad asked me if I wanted to go to the pool. I of course said yes, so we took a couple of towels and went to the pool. We left our stuff under a tree and went to the water. This is a really big pool. It's about 40 meters long. I'm not sure how to explain this, but on one side there is a pool, and on the other side is a river. My dad loves fishing, so we went to the other side to see if someone was fishing. He ran into his old buddy and they started talking. I was really bored, so I asked my dad if I can walk for a little bit. He said yes. This is a pretty safe little town where nothing ever happened, so kids were free to do anything they wanted. I went to the other side of the pool, and my dad was still talking to his friend, and after a while, I couldn't see them anymore. I was in the water when I noticed this old creep staring at me. I just looked at him and started swimming. He asked me if I wanted him to help me swim. I said no. Then he asked me how old I was. I was pretty confused, so I told him my real age. Then he started hugging me. I told him to leave me alone, but then he started kissing me and touching my lady parts. Nobody seemed to notice. I was trying to scream, but his hand was on my mouth. When he took me out of the water, I bit his finger and kicked him in the balls. I started running as fast as I could, and he started chasing me. Luckily, I was faster than him. He stopped at the middle of the pool and went back. I ran to my dad and I asked him if we could go home. He asked me why, but I just started to scream that I wanted to go home, so we took our stuff and went home. I never told him. I never told anybody. Creep from the pool? I hope I never see you again. Number 13.
This happened when I was around 12 or 13. My parents and I were going on a trip for a couple days, and while they were getting our stuff inside the house, they told me to stay outside and watch the car. It was daylight, and this is a safe neighborhood. I'm outside for a couple minutes, sitting down on the lawn, and I see a pickup truck pull across the street, and this old-looking man gets out of the truck and comes towards me. I get up, and he starts telling me he sells homemade chairs and that he has one in the back of his truck that he can show me. He seemed off to me, so I told him I was going to ask my parents. So I'm rushing to the door and start knocking. Our outside door locks automatically. My mom comes out and I tell her what the man told me, but he interrupts me and tells her I called him over or that I needed help or something like that, which my mom knew was a lie. My mom told him she was going to call the cops and then he left. My dad had to calm her down since she was freaking out and thinking that the guy was going to take me, and after she was calm, we continued putting things in the car. So, the weird part of this was when the man's car was following us a while later. My dad was so pissed off that he braked the car and pulled over to the side and actually tried to follow the man's car and get his license plate. The man sped away, so we lost him by then, and it left us pretty scared for a few months since he knew where we lived. Even though it's been a few years, I still don't like being outside alone anymore.
Number 14.
Hi there. This is my first post, so I apologize if I make any mistakes. But after looking for a while, I just had to share this story told to me by one of my coworkers. So one summer, a few years ago, she and her then boyfriend and now husband decided to go to Ontario to visit friends and family. While there, they made the decision to camp out over the weekend by one of the many lakes scattered throughout the province. One campground they had been directed to by friends was beautiful but absolutely packed with holiday goers, and if you're anything like them or myself, you find the more solitude provided by a campground, the better. So they chose instead to head down the road a little further, where they had seen signs for another campground. The new site was breathtaking, she said. Absolutely stunning, with huge maple trees and a sandy beach, with the waves gently lapping against the shore. However, it was dead empty. Not a single camper or tent in the entire place. But they just couldn't understand why people were choosing to shove themselves into a packed campground while another perfectly acceptable location was just a few kilometers down the road. They didn't think much more of it after that and simply paid for the night and set up a tent while going about their evening business, hanging out around the fire and taking in the lovely surroundings. She told me they went to bed roughly around 11:30 p.m., just after it got dark. My coworker awoke in the middle of the night to a strange feeling. She knew something was wrong, but couldn't put her finger on it immediately in her sleepy haze. She lay there in the pitch black for a while, and rather than drifting back to sleep, her feeling of unease grew as she pulled further awake. Suddenly, she realized what was wrong. There was breathing. Extra breathing. Not that of herself or her boyfriend, but the sound of someone else just beyond the walls of their tent. She lay quietly for a second, making sure what she heard wasn't only her imagination, fear gripping her heart and taking her breath from her lungs. Slowly and quietly, she shook her boyfriend awake, urging him to be silent. He gripped her hand as he too heard the sound of another person outside the tent. Neither of them had any idea what to do. Sure, they could emerge from the tent and confront the person, but what if there was more than one hiding in the dark? What if they had a weapon? My coworker and her boyfriend didn't have anything to defend themselves with other than basic camping necessities, so they spent the night wide awake, listening, while whoever was standing just beyond the protection of the tent breathed easy, occasionally moving from one side of the shelter to the other, but never doing anything more than lurking. The next morning, as the sun came up, they heard footsteps of someone slowly walking away from the tent. They immediately packed all of their belongings and left the site, now having a very good idea of why such a lovely campsite had been so incredibly empty. On their way out, they informed the owner of the campground of their nighttime visitor. It was an elderly couple who claimed to have no idea who it could have been, or why someone would spend the entire night watching their tent. Regardless, they left quickly and never went back. To this day, she still says it was one of the most unsettling and scary nights of her life.
Number 15. My husband works nights sometimes. His shifts rotate, 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., that sort of thing. I wasn't too bothered by it until the other night. We live in a fourplex, one beside and two behind, all on a single level. Since I'm not working yet, I'm pretty familiar with the comings and goings of my neighbors. Heck, I even know what everyone's cars sound like. It was probably just after midnight and I was talking to some friends over Skype when I heard the door handle jiggle. At first, I thought maybe my husband was home early and I got up to greet him. Then, quickly realized I hadn't heard his work boots on the gravel or his car. I went really still and I kept listening, just in case I was mistaken. Finally I yelled, "Hello?" Just silence. Then I heard something in the lock. My husband likes me to be protected, so he bought us a couple of guns. I grabbed the shotgun and pumped it once. It's loud enough without actually putting ammo in that you know what it is. Then I yelled, "I have a gun and I know how to use it. Get lost before I call the police." Big, heavy footsteps ran off across our graveled lot, and I stayed up the remainder of the night until the sun came up. Then I finally fell asleep. My husband came home later that morning and was worried when he found me in bed at 11 a.m., but let me sleep a little longer once I explained what happened. He had the next day off, so we went to visit some friends of his. When we got back, we discovered the pumpkins I had next to the stoop were all knocked over, like someone was looking for a key. My husband did a quick sweep of the house before we went in, but we're looking for a new place now. Person trying to break into our place? Let's not meet. Number 16. A few years back, me and a few friends had walked across our town to go to the town center. We were around 13 at the time. Our town was not huge, but it was one of the bigger towns in the county. There was a lot of crime in the area, usually to do with drugs. We were walking along one of the main roads because it was the shortest way to get to the town center. We were all staying at our friend John's house later that night, and we wanted to get some snacks and maybe some new games if they were cheap. We made it to the town center, all was well and good. But on the way back is when it got a bit creepy. About halfway between John's house, which is on the really bad side of town, and the town center, while walking down the main road, we noticed a man in a dark jacket walking behind us. It was around 5 p.m. and it was February, so it was getting a bit darker. We thought nothing of it initially, but as we walked further and further, we noticed he was still following us. We decided to pick up our pace to try and get back as fast as we possibly could, while trying to remain calm. Despite taking a different route home to try and lose this man, he stuck with us, walking about 10 meters behind us. We were at the bottom of John's street when the man started to slow down. We got back, and while we were shaken up about the man following us, we didn't think it was a big deal, so we didn't bother telling John's mom or brother. Later on, around 9 p.m., John's mom went out to spend time with some of her friends, and his brother was at a neighbor's house. We were sitting in the living room. John's house was laid out in a way that the sofa in the living room was visible from the kitchen, and the kitchen had a window at the front side of the house. We were watching a film and I went to get a drink. I walked to the fridge next to the window and got some Coke. When I closed the door, I glanced at the window to look out. I thought I noticed someone there, but it was dark outside, and the light was on in the kitchen, so it was hard to see outside properly. I shrugged it off and walked back to the living room. About 20 minutes passed, and I glanced back over to the window. Now the kitchen light was off, as was the living room light, making it easier to see outside. I could quite clearly see a man there, and he looked exactly like the man who was following us on the way home, wearing the same dark jacket, staring at me and my friends intently. I looked back at the TV, not trying to give anything away. I told my friends that I thought there was someone at the window, but to not all look. John turned and looked. He was as shocked as I was. We were all 13 years old and home alone. Needless to say, we pretty much shat ourselves. John got up and went over to the home phone, which was just next to the front door, and called his brother. He said he would come over straight away. We made sure that the front door and the back door was locked, and sat in the living room until his brother came back. Thankfully, the man was gone by the time John's brother got back. We checked the house and the garden just in case he was hiding somewhere, but he was gone. We all thought this would be the end, and that we wouldn't see the man again, but a few weeks later, me and my friends were walking to a sports event, taking the same route we had taken previously, and we saw the man again. This time he didn't follow us, but as we walked past, he stared at us intently. None of us knew who this man was, or why he followed us. None of us have seen the man since, and hopefully we never will. Number 17. This still haunts me to this day. I remember it pretty vividly, and I consider myself to have a bad memory. When I was 10, my mother needed to go to Walmart to grab some groceries. Being the hard-headed kid I was, I didn't want to go inside, so she let me stay in the car. I was reading a book and listening to music when all of a sudden, an old, beat-up tan car parks next to me. I look over and it's some guy in his 50s. The guy then opens his car door, and he's completely naked except for a trench coat. I freak out and lock the doors. He begins to masturbate profusely while staring at me, and I just avoid eye contact. This goes on for about 10 minutes until he finishes and leaves. My mom comes back about 20 minutes later, and I tell her what happened. She's pissed and flags the security officer, but she didn't know English, so I don't think it got through. My mom never left me alone in the car again until I was in my teens, when I would just stay home. I also never found out any more information about him. Guy that robbed me of my innocence, let's never meet. Number 18. I lived on campus during my first year at my university, but it was a fun little college town. One night, my friends, Alexander, Anna, and I left our dorm to go to a sandwich place a little over a mile away. I'm paranoid as hell and always think I'm being followed when I'm out at night, but on our way back, Alexander started to make me feel really uneasy. He kept glancing back over his shoulder, so I told him to stop because he was making me freak out a little bit. He told me he was sure someone was following us. Alexander is a pretty big dude, 6'4", so someone following us made me feel really weird, because it didn't exactly look like we were skinny little girls walking alone. He made us walk in front of him so that he would be between the guy and ourselves, but I was starting to panic. We got into our residence hall and made a beeline for the doors that led to the rooms. You need to have a resident keycard to get in. This is the first time I can get a look at the homeless dude who's been following us, since I can finally see him in the light of the lobby. He follows us all the way to the door with the lock, puts his face up to the window, and smiles as he watches us take off down the hall. On the stairs, we heard the door open, and Anna and I almost screamed and sprinted to her room. Alexander went back to either confront him or report him. We talked to the police about it, and the next day, they did a follow-up with us. Apparently, that night, the same guy had gone into another resident hall on campus and found a door that had been propped open. He raped a girl in the bathroom. Number 19.
So, a little backstory to start. I live in a flat with only one neighbor above me. I have a son who is from a previous relationship that also lives along with me and my wife. So, this started a few years back in 2013 when we first moved into the flat. Everything went well and we were happy to have our own home. We were really friendly with the neighbors, especially the neighbor that lived above us. We were fine for the first year or so. She was an older lady in her late 50s. As a young couple, aged in our early 20s, it was nice to have someone who was so nice when we first moved in. We were approached within the first few weeks by our other neighbors, explaining how she was a little weird. Stories including vandalizing the previous tenant's car and throwing paint on the door. These even went as far as giving full bottles of vodka to an alcoholic that lived on our street because whenever he drank he got violent. This creeped us out a little, but she seemed so opposite of what we heard of her. We had been alright with each other for months. That's when things took a turn. We got a knock on the door from the police stating that we had been abusing my son. I was shocked. He was around 2 at this age and was happy as can be. I remember letting the police officer in and he came in, saw my son playing with his blocks in the living room, then the police officer rolled his eyes, apologized to me, and left. We spoke to the neighbor upstairs about it and she seemed to suggest it was another neighbor as she overheard them speaking about it. Thinking it was no good to dwell on it, we left it and nothing happened for a few weeks. A few weeks later, my son's mother came around and was rather distressed. She showed me some messages she got on Facebook from someone called John Smith. They explained that they worked at the nursery that my son attended and was concerned about my son, going into a lot of detail about how we would shout at him and abuse him. I flipped my shit and even gave her a copy of the recordings from my son's baby monitor. See, since the last time we were accused of anything, we installed a baby monitor that stored the last 7 days onto a server I have. This is linked to my mobile, perhaps due to paranoia after hearing of all the kidnappings that can happen. The funny thing that made no sense was that in the message, it had my full address. She and my wife's full names and details of our house, even about the background that I had on my computer, which was a payday background. It made no sense at all, and the only person in my house was the neighbor upstairs and my parents. I don't like people within my space, and she used to come around and use our bathroom and shower as her bathroom was being converted into a wet room. Later on, I got a phone call from the neighbor, and she said that some white nationalist was trying to find me. Now, I'm half Cast Indian. Apparently I said something they didn't like, and they came to batter me. She explained what they looked like and that they had leather gloves, but she lied and said I didn't live there. I phoned the police, and we were on a watch list due to the threats that were said. All passed to me from her upstairs and no one else. She got an interview with the police and denied any of it happening, and she said that I was on drugs. Now, I have not touched drugs in years, and even then, it was only a little bit of cannabis. Things got a bit weird, and she had her son starting to live with her. One evening, we were playing D&D, and around 9:30 p.m., we got a text from her explaining she wanted quiet or else. Things had been slowly escalating up until this point. I replied, "Fuck off, it's 9:30, we finish at 11. I wouldn't have minded, but this had been a regular occurrence for a few weeks. We play on Saturday nights, and this had not been a problem for a year or so. Things escalated further. She started banging on the floor, put the vacuum on, and threatened to send her son down to come do me in. I confronted him the next day about this, and he denied everything and said that his mom was a bit sensitive. Turns out she has bipolar. This all makes sense now, from poisoning my plants and lawn to threatening me with her sons. She is now left and has a for sale sign on her flat, and that explains why the house was so cheap when we got it. So, sociopath neighbor, please don't move back in." I now know that some people just want to watch the world burn.
Number 20.
This happened last year on Halloween. A lot of creepy stuff happens on Halloween, and this is no exception. I'm 5 feet tall and 105 pounds. Not a very intimidating figure. I'm transgender, and I look a little more on the feminine side of things. I was out on Halloween with my girlfriend at the time. We'd gone into the city. We're from a college out in a small town, to go to a haunted house, and we were walking back to the train station from the haunted house at about 12:30 a.m. to go home. We were both dressed up like witches, both wearing high heels, and I had my purse with me. My girlfriend's hands were cold, so I was holding her hand and walking very close to her. Yes, these are all very important details. The city was almost like a ghost town as we were walking back. We saw almost nobody else. We were walking along a main road, just going under an overpass, when a car full of 20-somethings drove by us, going the opposite way, and a guy hung out the window and shouted, "Ugliest lesbian couple ever!" Of course, both of us were offended, but we just kept walking, and the car drove up off the street. We were about 2, maybe 3 blocks from the train station, and this train station is in the heart of the city, with a lot of elevated highways and railways and overpasses surrounding it, so it tends to be very shadowed, especially at night. We heard the sound of a car engine off to our right, across the street, and at this point, my girlfriend whispered to me, "It's the same car." I glanced over, and it was the same car from earlier. The people had gotten out of the car and were kind of milling about it, but I could tell they were looking at us. I was very nervous at this point because being both queer and transgender, you face a lot of potential violence and hate crimes. All of the stories about trans people and lesbians and gays getting beaten to death were flashing through my head. I was terrified. About a year ago, my dad had told me I had to carry something for self-defense, but instead of mace or something, he gave me a flashlight. It's about 8 inches and very sturdy, made of steel and incredibly bright. This thing will temporarily blind you for a good minute, and it has a raised, beveled edge that would likely hurt like a bitch if you were hit with it. I reached into my purse and pulled out the flashlight, gripping it tight in my free hand. There was the sound of breaking glass behind us, and both of us looked over our shoulders to see the group of people crossing the street towards us. There was broken glass in the street, and from what I could make out in the streetlights, one of the people was holding a broken beer bottle. I said to my girlfriend, "We need to get out of here now." We ran the remaining 2 blocks to the train station, but not very quickly because we were in high heels. And the entire time, we could hear the group running after us. Heavy steps, shouting slurs, maybe 50 feet behind us the whole way. When we got to the train station, we immediately bolted for the brightest area with the most people around, and looked around for the group. But they didn't come to the station. It hit me really hard right then, how close we'd come to being statistics.